모스트 보던 팟캐스트.
Welcome everyone to Most Modern. Joining us today is Sam Naylor. He's a licensed architect and a researcher with focus on housing design. So he's currently an associate at Util Design and the author and editor of the State of Housing Design 2023. Welcome to Novo.
Hey, Minku. Glad to be here.
Sam, why housing? Why do you like housing so much?
Why housing? Yeah, I love it. I really came to, I've been an architect for only a decade maybe, but I've been focusing on housing for the last 5 years and, really like it for one, it's like the scale you can work at. And I do work at UTL from zoning and like city regional things all the way down to door details and what does a kitchen look like and how do you use your kitchen. So that scale change is really refreshing and great, especially when you have multiple projects at once and you can change the way your brain is working between solving problems at different scales. That's like one reason. The next reason is it's really important to be focusing on it right now. We're in a housing crisis. We need a lot more housing from the supply side, but we also need better quality housing in the US. And there's not been enough housing, there hasn't been enough architects, good architects and developers and people really interested in creating quality housing in the US. It hasn't been the center of like the discipline, for maybe 40 years, 50 years. So it's exciting to see it come back in force. And I'm, excited to be working on a really important issue. It has a lot of obstacles. And lastly, it's just so personal. And whereas like you could work on a cruise ship or something that you only visit a couple times, or museums that are like an occasional thing, like we all live in a house or a home. Some of them are houses, some of them are other types. And I can like renovating my house, I can go through the renovation process and then instantly at work, we're proposing something that's similar. Like I tested something out, or like I'm designing my kitchen, then I design a kitchen for someone else. And it leads to a direct connection to the design. That's great. And you still want to like gain feedback, and not everyone should probably have their kitchen the way I have mine. I've always been like, a lot of architects like open shelving, but then a lot of other people don't. But you can have a more personal connection to the work, which I think is great and allows you to, be a better designer.
So did that lead you to start the research when you started studying at GST on the state of housing design?
Yeah, I came to the GSD for grad school for a post-professional degree, and it's in the midst of, a housing crisis and COVID crisis and a lot of things. I've just begun to take a lot of housing classes and research things. And then when I graduated, connected with the Joint Center more. And I had done a few small research things in school. And then we dreamed up this project, the book. We also talked about other things we would do to get the Joint Center more involved with design and the physical aspect of housing. And creating a book on design, the idea was like a sister report to their yearly published for 40 years now, the State of the Nation's Housing Report, but one focused on design. So we, came up with that when I was graduating, and then it took 2 or 3 years to really work on it. A lot of times nights and weekends for me. And then we came up with this book, which was very exciting and gotten a lot of great press, and was like the first time that they've seriously looked at a survey of national housing design.
Yeah. Can you tell us about the Joint Center for Housing Studies here?
Yeah, so the Joint Center for Housing Studies, very old, I think 40 or 50 years old, but you can look on their website. I don't have it memorized. It used to be Joint Center between Harvard and MIT. Some years ago, they split. Now MIT has, I think, the Lowenthal Center for Urbanism, and there's a Joint Center here. And now it's the Joint Center, joint between the Graduate School of Design and the Harvard Kennedy School policy. So it's ostensibly, a center for housing that blends economics, social sciences, architecture, design, real estate, and all these kinds of things. But in reality, a lot of its output in the last few decades has been economic reports and data analytics and kind of looking at housing by the numbers, very diverse and like thorough way that they, a lot of the nation looks at their research and Congress asks them to testify and the New York Times writes about the work. But that's what they've been doing. But then around the time I was at the GSD, there was interest to get them more involved in seriously doing design research. They also fund a lot of studios and scholarships and grants here at the GSD, which is fantastic for furthering housing education. But less has been done as like a product of the center in relation to design directly.
It's great that you're championing that effort, and this book being a great evidence of that. Like for the listeners out there who are curious for this book, I mean, this book is available in almost all the bookstores, right?
Yeah, I found it abroad in Germany at a store, and it's you can get it online. Barnes and Noble, it's still a thing, I found out. And Amazon and such. This is our second printing now because we ran out of our first run. Didn't find any typos either, so it was just press reprint, and you can get it everywhere. I really pushed for it to be a physical object because it's so easy now to do a project and make it a PDF.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of work that went into making the PDF an accessible PDF also. But we partnered with Normal Design Studio out of Chicago to do the graphic design work. They're fantastic partners. They really brought beauty and life to the book. And it's been great. It's distributed by Harvard University Press, but it's published by the Joint Center. We published it ourselves.
What can the listeners expect to learn from the book? Can you give us just a...
Yeah, I mean, what was interesting is we wanted to blend the analytical survey style of a quote report with the more typical design publication that's just like case studies on buildings. And we wanted to blend those two. We ended up with something that was using projects as our data. So we have about 114 projects in the book that we survey. We only looked at built projects built in the last 3 years, built in the US, and that were really, really innovative designs. We use those as our data. And then from that, I came up with 26 themes or ideas about housing design. And those themes are how the book is organized. With 9 of those themes, which are more maybe prescient or important, we had design journalists we invited to write about them. And even that was really exciting because when design journalism is kind of a dying trade, not many newspapers have an architecture critic anymore. It was really good to work with those people. We wanted people that had an objective eye towards housing and not just academics or practitioners who have their own agenda. And then we wrote the other themes and kind of interlaced them as like a running long, short form narrative for the book. So inside, here's the book. I mean, it's my video. Nice. This, yeah. It's got some weight to it. It's beautiful. Thank you. We also have a survey at the beginning. So inside you'll find, I think, a lot of great insights into contemporary American housing. There was like a good write-up of it, a review, which like talked about maybe the thesis being like, good design is possible, but it's only through miracles. Like the story of a lot of the projects is like, oh, because they got this weird funding, or they magically, like this really good architect found this good developer wanted to do something. And after 12 years of the zoning struggles, they finally made it happen.
12 years.
And like, yeah,
this was long.
Well, I guess we started this conversation and you're saying housing crisis is a big problem that we're all facing, but why is design such an important component and like potential solution space for this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think design as a discipline is helpful in unlocking production and density, first of all, and design thinking can help people unlock production, density, and affordability. But it's also the case that if we don't design quality homes that you're proud of, that you want to live in forever, you're not going to stay in that neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And through a lot of my travels, I would visit, visiting a lot of cooperatives around the world right now. And I never, people really talk about like living somewhere forever, which people don't talk about here necessarily. And the US is very transient. Like like a lot of my friends, I mean, we grow up somewhere, you go to college somewhere, and then you find a job somewhere, and then maybe you find your job leads you somewhere else, and um, you're less connected to both like maybe where you went to school or even where your family is currently. And that's a bit of a tangent, but just to say, like, if we build homes that you want to live in, then you might stay in places longer and you might actually raise kids near transit. Whereas right now, cases, the majority of new housing development in greater Boston is like studios and 1 bedrooms and some 2 bedrooms. Of course, they're very expensive and they're in double loaded podium buildings. And so if you want to have a garage, like a place to have your kids play outside, like play music in your building, do the kinds of things that you imagine doing in a single family house that like make life and like growing old and starting a family possible, just like basically impossible in contemporary multifamily in most of America. And so then you have to move further away from the city, and then you have to like drive or commute, or maybe you're moving away from your friends or spending more time in the car. So I think like designing better multifamily at the scales that can support transit and that can like make our cities affordable is really, really important. It's not just about numbers. And I think just focusing on numbers loses that. Yeah.
Yeah, homes are seen as tools for growing your asset. It's like an investment,
Yeah.
more or less. But like you have a great point. Like I think design makes one to wanting to live there for a long term and actually just like that space so much that you don't leave.
Yeah.
But there is also some realistic difficulties to building those type of larger scale homes because on the developer side, you worry about it being sold, and it's very easy also for the investors to give you money to do some things out there that's quite common that they see that have been sold in the past. So we're constantly battling with that, with our past and what was done. So you're also championing in terms of the design thinking and the design language to tackle these policy issues that may be, locking some potentials that the current system has to do better design. So can you tell us a little bit more about what are the issues that you're interested in now?
But I think just to go back on your first point, I think it's important to note that like, because of the way projects get funded, working with the developer, often you'll find that like, oh, we can only do this because this is what they did last time, or this is what everyone is doing, and thus it's proven to be like profitable. And as I've gotten further along and talked to more people as well, I found sometimes it's like you get a really good developer that's like, let's push the envelope, let's do something different. But then it's the banks, it's the lenders who are like, I'm not going to underwrite this because it needs to be the way I want to see it. So it all goes back to that. What was interesting traveling is also seeing different funding and development mechanisms. So in Australia, like building rental properties is very atypical and rare. So build to rent is a new model. It's like a fancy term they're using to solve the housing crisis over there. They don't have any institutional landlords. To get funding for a new multifamily, it'll always be condos, and you have to get 80% of the funding pre-selling the units. And so people put down $5,000 or something as a deposit, and then 3 to 5 years later, the building gets built and they can re-up or like give it to someone else. But then the like bank who's getting the rest of the money or the developer has the security that like there is a market demand for these units as designed. Maybe there could even be, I've seen some projects where there's input between the people putting deposit down. There's like a whole range of like how much influence those future buyers could have. But then it's a more direct relationship between the product, less speculative and a little bit more personal, not as much as like a co-development, a bow grouping or something. But
So like Assemble,
like a
Nightingale.
yeah, I talked to Assemble.
That's great.
Yeah.
I would love to talk to them at some.
I guess like, can we talk about what the standard model in the US is?
Well, the thing about the difference is that in the US, pre-selling is illegal. So this model heavily relies.
Is it really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it is illegal. So because there was all this issues of speculative development, and for Korea's case, pre-sale is all these like
So is the U.S. It's like protecting the consumer. That's the idea.
exactly.
Yeah, the issues like in China. That's why the whole real estate market collapses because of pre-selling speculation.
Yeah, but pre-selling in this case, in Australia's case, they're using that so that they have certainty in who will be occupying this. And by having that relationship, the occupiers it's different. It carries a different weight during the community engagement process. If the developer comes in and advocates for the project versus the person who will be living there when it's built, who's going to advocate for that process and say, this is what I want and this is what I like. I'm going to live here. I'll be your neighbors.
But like, is that model why like built to rent is so new in Australia as opposed to here? Like,
Rent to own model. Like,
Oh, those are two separate things. I mean, that's also an evolution, like a hybrid between when you could start to build up equity and then eventually buy your own unit. But I don't know the history of why it's more rare. They also have a history of single family suburbanization, much like the US. And it's, I don't know. That's a good question.
I'm assuming that the growth of the cities were quite limited in like a couple of cities only, and not.
it could also be like, I guess, the financial situation, right? Like developers don't get to make all the calls.
Yeah,
As we like.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is, though, that Sam, you're talking about how personal housing is. I also think it's extremely personal when it comes to your personal finances. Like in America, we use housing to build wealth. It's like, I mean, it's in question right now, but it was sort of orthodox to just put down that down deposit, that down payment when you could, try to get in, you start at home, kind of try to build up. It's getting harder and harder to do that. I think other places, they just don't have that same culture potentially. But it does have a huge effect on sort of product. And I do think that's quite interesting is a lot of developers will say, well, yeah, we can't propose what the designers are thinking because there's no market for that yet. I don't necessarily feel like they existed. There's
No, they have
pre-sale, the pre-sale kind of,
They don't. No, they need someone else to do it. And then even if you point to someone else in the US, they're like, well, that hasn't been done in Boston though. And
right.
like even there's all these sub hypermarkets. We're hoping to make where I live, our building, which is a very small 3-unit building, a cooperative. But when we talk to lawyers, they're like, it's really weird. And like everything's just a condo in Boston. You should just condoize it. And we're like, well, why? Just tell us pros and cons. They're like, it's just weird. It's just like, it's atypical. But if you just go down to New York, it's like 80 to 90% of the ownership is cooperative buildings, and it's not weird. So everyone likes to do things the way they've done them before.
Yeah.
But back to Lito's question, is that how we got here, this housing crisis? Because we just kept on saying, well, that's what they did before. And so generation after generation, we get to this moment where, yeah, we have a bunch of single family homes, but the population is boomed and we want density and all this.
There's a recent, New York Times article to try to re-explain the housing crisis, and they framed it as still a result of, or exacerbated by COVID, putting builders out of business, and we have the glut of supply since then, and now are missing all those builders. And so it's like haven't caught up and then are still not catching up. But that's just assuming we should be building the same way we have. And just to say the suburbanization, that kind of density of housing is unsustainable economically, also unsustainable environmentally. And we have to build in different ways, but that faces so much friction in every part of the country to densify. What's been really interesting in Massachusetts is with the release of the new MBTA communities law. So California has done this. I think there was another state. Zoning has been the biggest hurdle the last few decades to increasing housing density and production in cities and unlocking zoning. People are increasingly trying to do it at higher levels so that the effect of that zoning is less specific, and then maybe it's more acceptable when you don't think it's my backyard, but it's just someone's backyard. So Minneapolis, they upzone the whole city and just said no single family zoning anywhere. In California, I think it's statewide, and they also did a statewide ADU. And in Massachusetts, there's now an ordinance that's going through towns that's saying there's many different tiers and specifics, but if you're a town that's connected in any way to the MBTA, you have to allow, as of right, some part of your city near the transit station to allow multifamily housing. But it's facing, and I went to listening online to a community meeting last night, just extreme backlash from a lot of towns, not all of them, and certainly I think not the majority, because it's people just kind of fixed their zoning in the 60s and 70s and haven't updated them and don't want to change. And worried about, it's there's all these like intractable forces when your whole wealth is tied up in your home, and you're really worried about that going down, even though new housing might actually increase its value. And then you're going to vote for people that protect your biggest asset, and it's protectionist. So everything's tied, of course, and I'm in favor of like having less equity tied to your real estate.
Yeah, me too. I don't want to put all my time to single hope for the best. So it is a little bit of education that needs to happen. And I'm also like, it gets me puzzled with why are these communities pushing back on new development? Because I think what it will do is it will increase the property value, not just for that development alone, but for the others too.
There's a lot of reasons. I mean, a lot of them boil down to like being scared of change and not feeling in control. So in Massachusetts specifically, I've never done an as-of-right zoning project ever. And every community loves its power of special permit. And that means any new development above like a house or a triplex, they get to set the rules and they get to like tweak with it and say, well, you have to do this, you have to do this. We get to like modify it. Everyone has to go through a process. That results in a lot less housing and makes housing more expensive, but it means they have full control. And every community feels, I mean, rightly so, that they're a unique place and they should control that. And there's a lot of fear that as of right means anything goes and they can't control their communities.
You heard from me.
Oh, yeah.
And then it's what's as of right?
Oh, sorry. So, like, zoning sets building form, like, density and use. So saying, can you have housing, commercial, how big can it be, how many units and square feet, and kind of parking you might need. So, as of right means you have a project that fits within the parameters. If it's just like zoned for 3-family residential with 1 parking spot, you're going to build a 3-family with 1 parking spot or less. Every project I've worked on, 100% of the projects almost in our office are requesting variances from zoning. So they're going to build more than what's allowed now. And every single town has a different process to get those variances. And then some towns are in support of more density, but to change the underlying zoning is a very arduous process and political and legally long. So sometimes they don't change the zoning, they just create a political environment where creating variances is easy, or maybe it's hard. But it's political and it's reading the tea leaves, and it, makes everything more expensive and longer generally.
So is this why like changing things at the zoning level is important? Because it sets the rules. You can build the rules, but if you do anything else, you need to get kind of special variances that depend on either the local community, the local political climate. That's not as cut and dry as.
And it's more transparent and it's more democratic to say, like, let's actually set real rules that reflect what we want to be built. Whereas in Boston, they've been allowing like a ton of new development, but very few of it is actually as of right. It's just that the political regime has its own set of rules, some of them written down, some of them not written down. And developers and architects in the know sort of know the rules, but as someone new to the space, you would have no idea what you could actually do unless you go through it. So yeah, we should write clear rules. I mean, New York City has actually very clear rules, so much so that you can quantify them, and there's companies that can easily output you like your maximum buildable area for a site, and the public then knows what can happen. Real estate actually is easier to trade and commodify in that regime. Whereas here, what happens is sometimes you get the zoning approval for a site, and then you'll sell the site with the approval to someone else to build it because you've unlocked a new density for a future imaginary building. And so we're like trading on spot zoning. Anyways, this is like, and then the public doesn't really understand that. That's not good because they should, have an equal part in the built environment.
Yeah. I mean, I work mostly in California and San Francisco, which in a lot of ways mirrors a lot of Boston's issues. What I also find is that I wonder, like, why is this the case? Why is it still the case? You have politicians, you have people out there saying we need more housing. Right? Then when you get into it, you realize that there's this whole like cottage industry of people who are upholding the current regime. Yeah. Like, for example, the expediter.
The expediter,
Right?
Yeah.
Good people.
Yeah. Lawyers, more lawyers.
Should not have a job. Like, that should not exist. I should not
know there are expediters for every source.
There's tech startups that are just a technology surface over expedite.
Yeah, like you should not have to pay somebody to basically allow you to do what you're paying your taxes already for.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much of our issues right now are just basically incentives butting up against each other. And I'm not saying it's a moral evaluation of anybody, but the fact that, you have this job, you have this position, and it's sort of baked into the system.
Yeah, the zoning itself is arcane. So like adding densities, but even if you hit the density that's allowed, if you need like if you're less than a foot of setback of what needs to happen because of your odd shape of land, you still need to go through variance.
Yeah.
So that's how arduous the process is. But actually the renewing of zoning on the higher level would make a significant impact. And for example, I heard that Cambridge is trying to allow every single lot in Cambridge to build up to 6 stories. That will be as of right. So if that happens, then it's going to be a new game.
But does it take that sort of just like, sorry, this is what we're doing, we have to change our collective mentality about what the built environment is going to look like in order to make change? Or do we need that sort of sea change, or can we do it more incrementally?
I mean, I think it helps to spread the burden a little bit in towns. But it helps to have good zoning that has clear rules, and also, so we work on zoning, we'll write zoning, and it is maybe what we call like form-based light. So it's not all the way mandating hyper-specific form-based rules, but it's also not super open-ended in saying any kind of 6-story building you can build. And so inside there is rules about open space and setbacks that feel loose to allow a whole host of diversity of architecture to happen, but transparent enough that you could reasonably, and we do always like test fit out the sites to show people this is what might be built. And also always testing the worst case scenario for people to be, because real estate, you would always want to maximize your value. So you want to show people what would actually get built. And I think doing that kind of process helps unmask what zoning is and how land use gets unlocked for the public. And we found there's tons of reception when you actually have those design guidelines as part of the legal zoning rules, which is different than the way existing old zoning codes have been written, where there's the legal rules about setbacks and height, and then, quote, design guidelines, which are not legal, and they're just a bunch of fun text that like no one has to abide by, and you can make any case to say this abides by design guidelines. So in Cambridge, on part of Mass Ave, there are still design guidelines that are like legally on the city's website. They're written in the 70s. It looks crazy. There's handwritten notes. You can't read half of it. It's like Xeroxed sketches of Victorian eaves saying like what kind of buildings we want. And I don't know, it's a little wild that one that's still on the books, but also not legally enforceable. It's a suggestion and seems kind of pointless. We should just have slightly less rules, make them really transparent and clear, and have everyone like agree about them.
I want to press you on this a little bit because I agree with you. I think that we should have a little bit more freedom, but how much freedom is appropriate?
Yeah.
Because at the same time, you want to maintain coherence with an existing city. You want to make sure that there's not a lot of conflict aesthetically between buildings. What's your take on that?
Yeah, don't know. It's sometimes you can do it through tiers. Like Boston does have an onerous entitlement process, but I think they've thought through it heavily. So as your building gets bigger, there's more tiers of review. And if you're a big enough building, which I've worked on, you go through the highest tier, which is the Boston Civic Design Commission. And so there's a dozen or so of the city's top architects, landscape architects, and urban designers get to judge your building and tell you how it should change. And I think that's really good for some of the most important buildings to go through such a rigorous peer review process, like you peer review an academic paper or something. And for smaller buildings that are just adding a garage, shouldn't have to go through that. And so it's a gradient. But in terms of setting rules, I think it's okay for a community to say we don't want vinyl clad buildings at all, just to make other kinds of rules like no vinyl. One, it's like bad for the environment and it looks terrible and it's not going to age well and bring character to our community. But you maybe shouldn't go so far to require things that are too expensive and then you're prohibiting new development. So Somerville has I think their zoning is pretty intense, but they do have even material designations in their guidelines, what you can and cannot do. But then every site is unique, and it's tough when you have the guidelines so strict that then every site has to go through special approval, and they're fighting back on. So it's a dialogue, and I think it's best to set things up, work with developers, see what is like friction, and then change the rules. And Somerville has been changing rules as they hear from developers.
Yeah, they had the most recent zoning updates.
Yeah.
A couple of years back. So zoning is one thing. And then there's another issue, which is related to the building.
Yeah.
Permit, which I know that you've done a lot of work trying to tackle the single stair use. So tell us about that.
I wrote this report also. It just came out. And yeah, I think the zoning has been the focus of housing advocates and policymakers for decades, but the building code itself has been like invisible, and it's usually it's the domain of architects and builders and developers, and it's not easy to digest. I learned about it through school and licensure and practice. It's a intense set of rules. You only learn about the thresholds by working in a city and understanding project costs by doing projects. But to say like a lot of the housing we want to get built is illegal because of zoning, but then also it's too expensive because of the building code. So single stair reform has been a growing movement. It's in the US only started a couple of years ago, but now it's national movement. Also in Canada, this month, British Columbia allowed mid-rise single stair buildings to be legal. There's bills to make it legal soon in California, Washington State, and Oregon. And a dozen other states and cities are have efforts in progress to make it legal. But the issue, they back up to say, most multifamily housing in the U.S. Is either very small scale or if it's above a certain size, it's a double-loaded podium building. It's 5/1. You'll see articles everywhere like, why is everything so ugly? SketchUp contemporary podium buildings. It's a type of building that now produces the majority of all units, and it's a scale that's quite fixed. I mean, we have the 5/1s in Boston, and Texas, you might have 6/2s. The numbers refer to both the construction types and the floors of the building. They're types of buildings that have one long corridor in the middle that connects two staircases, and then units are on both sides of the corridor, or what we call double loaded, just like a parking row is double loading parking. You have to do that because any building above 3 stories or more than 12 units has to have 2 stairs. And so this is what we get because it's the most efficient. Developers and architects have found it to be the most efficient way to produce housing that has to have 2 stairs. But That's really unique to the US and Canada and Uganda and Pakistan. But that's it. Everywhere else in the world allows housing, mid-rise multifamily housing, to just have one stair and often one elevator. It's hard to explain on a podcast without all my great drawings, but if you think about it, the long corridor, it only exists to connect two stairs. And if you just had one stair, you don't need the corridor either, and units can go around it. And then if you think, okay, but we want like a lot more housing on this big site, you can have a bunch of individual single stair buildings next to each other. And then all the units in those buildings could have windows on at least two sides of the unit compared to only windows on one side. And so it unlocks all these possibilities if you were to legalize it here, that allow for greater ventilation, sunlight, shorter walk to your unit. It's easier to escape your unit in a crisis. And it's a smaller scale of building that is, you might get to know your neighbors in. And if you have traveled around the world or grew up and have lived in any kind of old building, even in a US city, you know a single stair building. It's a courtyard building in Europe. It's a dingbat in Los Angeles. It's a Fenway brick building here, or a Back Bay row house. It's how the majority of the built environment has been created and is still created abroad. So all new housing I've ever toured is single stair, unless it's a very high-rise building or it's a special case.
What do you see as the biggest pushback? I mean, the policy side will take its time, but in reality, is it the fire department who will be complaining?
Yep. Presumably it's two stairs in case one is blocked. You can still.
The rule ostensibly came about from 1840s tenement fires in New York City. The tenement buildings were very crowded and poorly built, and there's a lot of disasters. So they said you have to have two means of egress outside of a space for redundancy in case one is blocked. That started with one stair plus a fire balcony, so like a cast iron railing you could be rescued from or maybe jump. Then it became a cast iron fire escape with stairs or ladders. And then eventually those were only allowed for retrofitting old buildings, and you had to build like two protected stairs internally. Sometimes one of them can be external. But so that provision was made almost 200 years ago. And in the meantime, we've invented sprinklers, fire alarms, drywall, construction-proof walls and doors, air sealing, smoke evacuation techniques, and have vastly improved the way we build buildings. And so we argue in the report, also through a lot of other measures, why it's antiquated and we could create very safe single-stair buildings today. A lot of the pushback is that these would be unsafe, and so we can't do them. We point to both international case studies and also real numbers and facts about how these buildings can be safe. But it does get down to just this is the way we've always done it, and we're scared of change. So
As usual mentality.
we're not trying to push anything too hard. Everything should be still consensus-based, and we should talk to everyone, and everyone should have an open mind. We do build our buildings with more wood in North America, whereas most other places in the world build housing out of concrete. And so we should have different things. We need probably sprinklers and drywall, whereas concrete building might not. But we can make our buildings just as safe. And new multifamily buildings are extremely safe in the U.S.
What about the case of scissor stairs? Because I know that those are two staircases intertwined into one, and those are pretty standard use in high rises in New York. But it seems to be illegal to do that in Massachusetts.
They became illegal everywhere in the country after 9/11, except for New York. So everywhere else they're counted.
That's so weird.
It's also a little weird if you think about it. They're counted as one stair. You can still build it here. I think maybe you could build it if you had just trying to solve for the amount of people exiting a concert hall or something. I think those would be great as well. You can think about it, two stairs overlapping, but they're in the same footprint. So development wise, you gain great efficiency. And I also see even mid-rise buildings in New York, scissor stairs, because they're so efficient. And so in New York, they're like understood as two stairs, and the doors are still far enough apart from each other. But I think allowing that would be great as well.
I do live in a scissor stair.
You do.
So I can see it in my head what it looks like. But I guess like, if I was someone who cares about housing and I just hear you're like, okay, let's make two stairs, one stair.
Yeah.
Like, help me understand like the size of impact that actually.
Yeah, and it's also good to think about like the scale of building. I'm not going to like show a piece of paper to a screen, but we can, maybe there's show notes. We can post a link.
We'll post the PDF.
Awesome. It's also not like taking a big podium building and taking away one stair. You are still limited in the size. So it's a much smaller building. And if you actually do the comparison, there's less people per stair. So it's not just taking away a stair, it's a completely different building. But you're asking about like, what would that?
Yeah. So as a developer, does it allow me to build more units? Like,
Yeah.
like as a renter, would it help like the cost? Like, how does this help?
What are the impacts?
Yeah. It really impacts and helps small to medium sized projects. So on a very large site, post-industrial site, it's probably still more efficient from a numbers game to do a double loaded, very long building. But on any site smaller than, 10 or 12,000 square feet, project won't pencil today with two stairs unless it's a special condition with really high land use or an unusual aspect of it. So if you, on those kind of small sites, in the report, we looked at Boston parcels, greater Boston parcels, and the most average parcel is 45,000 square feet. So maybe that's like a double wide, triple decker, if you know Boston. On that site, the addition of the second stair in the hallway is like 10% of the floor. So it makes it 10% less efficient. And from a construction cost, that could be $200,000 to $500,000 for that project. Not to mention the loss of saleable or rentable area for you as the developer on every single floor. So it basically breaks a project or makes a project possible at the small scale. A lot now, I can't speak for like, will this make the building cheaper? Because you'll still build to market rents. But I think we want to make the argument that, we still agree with the supply side argument that we just need to build more housing, and overall you better meet supply. Demand will go down and we can have more affordable housing overall. So that's like a, scale argument.
Yeah, it does significantly improve the efficiency of the floor, meaning the floor that you build typically is not all sellable or all rentable. So the sellable rentable space ratio increases if you take out one stairs, because that's already covered by units.
So this will also help these smaller sites like Pencil, right? Where you said like, so instead of no building, there is a building there, and it's probably where housing is needed the most. Like,
and I was talking with a city council staff member this morning who wants to work on this issue in Boston, and they have a developer who's doing an office to resi conversion in downtown or the North End or something. So it's an old 6-story 18th century building, perfect for residential because the bays are enough to let in natural light and air. It's not like an 80s office building. But it had one stair when it was built, and now with the code they need to add a second stair. It both is going to cost a ton of money, a lot of money to cut through every floor of this old building and involve structural gymnastics. And then you lose all the saleable square foot on a really fixed floor plate. You can't increase the floor plate. It's an existing building. So it would also help, those kind of renovations.
Yeah, it will be great if they allowed to build it outside.
I think that'd be great. We have that as a sub recommendation. You can go to cold places in Montreal or Japan or like Norway, and they build multifamily with exterior staircases. You have no smoke issue, which is a big concern of smoke filling the staircase. You want to protect it from the snow and ice and things, but I think it's actually a great way. We enter, a single family house, the front door is outside. Why can't you enter your unit outside?
So if you combine it with some sort of outdoor open space and program, you would actually use the stair. Because
Actually use it.
the
Yeah.
other thing is these double stairs. I used to live in a Scissor building in New York too. But use the elevator mostly. I would take one stair, and then 6 months later, I realized there was another stair right behind it. It goes to the exact same place.
Yeah.
Yeah. We make that argument too, because I think it's a nicer way. It's the one way, so you might meet your neighbors in it versus like a hallway with an elevator on one long side, a stair on the other. And you're not going to stay in a corridor long because it's dark, and you have a shorter ceiling because that's where you run all your mechanical stuff. So.
And related to that, I think it's such a loss to just have an enclosed staircase for safety reasons. And I'm a developer. If I can find a way to enlarge that staircase experience and have it as a blended community room or like meeting space, like I would definitely want to build more.
Yeah.
Current code also requires you to have it's secluded and then also fire protected. And most of the case, like no one really uses that.
Well, it exists. How did the rules get that way? Like, was there like significant moments from one like rule to the other where like a big fire happened and you're like, okay, let's make it more stringent, or is it just like a progression of like this will be safer, this will be safer?
I think the majority of our code is written reacting to events, which is maybe not the best way. It'd be better to perhaps be predictive. And also, we're going through these reforms now, and I'm talking with experts, and like, we want to propose things that make a single stair building safer than a double stair because it doesn't have a second stair, so let's add some other things. But in order to add other provisions, you want to evaluate the options. There's like a million smoke control options to get the smoke out of a stairway. And every country has like a different product or a way of dealing with it. You have to provide like a method to evaluate those and like scientifically determine it. And the current code process doesn't have those working groups and funding set up that way. So I think we would also need to change the way we evaluate codes to be a little bit more like investigative and like open-ended and looking towards solving problems and not just reacting to what has happened. But it's also the case, like it's in the code, it says you can build an exterior staircase in Boston, but you don't see hardly any of them. And it's more of a like understood assumption. And if you try to go to the building department at the fire department, they will not let you do it. But you won't get something written down.
They don't care.
And the only building in recent memory that I've seen is the Gardner Museum, designed by a world famous architect, Renzo Piano, the addition to it. And they had to go through like 8 years of variance process with the fire marshal to get their second means of egress to be outside the building.
Yeah. Well, let's wait for everybody so that passes.
During another exhibition.
Oh yeah.
But it's on the other side of the wall. That was coming from others.
Talking about buildings that need to be.
Maybe the roof is.
Yeah, so we talked about a lot of constraints, regulation related constraints, zoning related constraints. Now let's go to the design. So, it's one thing to follow. We need to follow all these constraints and meet the requirements. So we also want to make it beautiful and make it also different.
Yeah.
How do you see that in your practice?
I don't know. It's a struggle. Push for things every day and you hope they stay in the project. You want to design things that have cross functionality that serve multiple purposes. That way they survive the tough cost revision and in zoning and just the tough process of getting a project built. And that's good design. Good design like serves multiple purposes. It's a staircase that is like egress for safety, also beautiful to walk up and like gives texture to the facade. Maybe shades a couple windows. It can do multiple things. And then it's hard to get rid of something that does so many things. But I don't know, like we look at projects all around the country and around the world, and I think it's good to do both. Look at stuff that's happening in your neighborhood under the same constraints and see how they did something and learn from that innovation. And usually each project has at least one like small thing they push the envelope on. But also be inspired by projects operating under completely different constraints in different countries, climates, and such. And you can't do exactly what they did, but you can still learn from how they approach the problem, and be inspired. But I think pushing the envelope, questioning assumptions everyone has, your client has, you have, your team has, about why something is the way it is, even if it's just a kitchen cabinet or hallway or something.
Yeah.
I think it's evident in the way that you discuss not just the building, but the larger forces at play. But for architects out there who are frustrated, who are like, oh, why do I have to do these 5+1, the same thing? It feels very formulaic. It feels like you speak multiple languages. So my first question is, how did you learn those languages? I'm not talking about French and Italian, but finance, policy, zoning, and then how do you try to deploy them within your own work?
That's back to your first question, something that's exciting about housing. And I think if you're going to be a good housing architect, you have to be political. You have to be engaged. You're going to be paying attention to local zoning reforms and city council meetings. Housing goes through more, perhaps, political processes than other projects because there's a lot of opposition. So then you have to know about that to make a housing project happen and be beautiful. You have to know the basics of a pro forma and development, like efficiency. If you're not drawing something that's going to pencil, you're going to be kicked out of the room, which is different than a lot of other typologies. So to do good housing, you feel like it's just naturally you have to learn a little bit, be a generalist about these different disciplines and languages. And then I've been fascinated by different parts of them and have tried to learn, although I'm by no means an expert on any one of them. But I think it's just by the nature of that type of design. And when I've seen beautiful projects and you dig in and you hear about, and a lot of the architects we talked to for the book, we hear about them talking about their projects. They know so much about the financials, about the zoning, about the mayor that was appointed that made the project happen, about the subcontractor's experience with fitting drywall in a certain cavity. And it's beginning to understand that the more you know about the implementation of the projects, the funding, all the way down to the building, you're actually going to make your designs happen more because you can anticipate those problems. And in contrast to other kinds of typologies, I don't know, speculative single-family homes or museums or something, they're less banked on understanding a pro forma because they're not based in economic profitability metrics.
I guess quickly guide us through one of the projects in the book. Maybe talk through each of these levels and how this project came together. I guess across all those things.
Yeah, I don't know. This one was so. I just toured this project. I'd never been before. We featured it in the book. Toured it on Wednesday. It's called Kala, Cala. It's a former school in Somerville that was converted into housing. It also has commercial space, parking underneath, and a park next door. It came out of a RFP process. The city of Somerville did a really robust engagement process to decide what to do with this school that has been vacant for many years, for I think decades. The school is not being used, and the parking lot was just a parking lot, and the building is empty. It's a very old, heavy precast concrete building, low rise, looks a bit bunkerish. Just imagine a school. And so the city, I think, set up a good process, did engagement, a great designer won the project, worked with a good landscape architect, and met the green roof contractor as well yesterday, and an interesting developer. And their proposal was to reuse the building. They explained it to us yesterday, although I have a lot of questions for them further, but that part of it was a cost analysis. Because the building is precast, is so much concrete, it would be so expensive to both demo it and transport it to, I imagine, New Hampshire or something. So they said we have to keep it, and it'll be just as affordable or maybe cheaper to keep the building, insert new housing. And then you have the weird shape of an old school and housing, which wants to be thin volumes with units. And even though school has classrooms, it still had a lot of weird spaces like a gym and a playground, and a lot more back of house, nearing building services that a housing building doesn't need. So the gym became a commercial space that's rented by an architecture firm right now. A lot of the back of house became a parking garage. They built this courtyard on top of the parking, and then there's units around it, and a lot of them have little patios because they had so much site area, and they really mostly used subtraction as a method of design rather than adding onto the structure. I don't know if it could have supported more weight. I'm not sure. But that allowed almost every unit to have its own little patio, and then created this unique landscape. It's really beautiful. Today, it's like grown even more than this photo. And then the city process. So next door, it's now a park. It was the completely asphalt parking lot, which had terrible stormwater and heat island effect. And now it's a community park. And as part of this process, this courtyard is completely public, and that deck there is completely public from 9 to 5. So it's like a pop-up, privately owned public open space. So it's a beautiful design with like interesting mixed-use functions, adds density at a scale that fits in with the neighborhood, all because of a great city and reusing an existing building, which saves carbon and creates really interesting architecture.
A good friend of mine actually worked on the development side of this.
Okay.
As a classmate, so we can probably.
You want to talk about that?
Yeah, we can probably invite him together.
Yeah.
Talk about this project.
I guess like the city found a developer to then develop this project, but was there any like community review for permitting? Like what was the community engagement process like that gets something like this built?
I don't know everything. I think there was a lot of it done before the RFP even went out. So an RFP would be like a request for proposals. And we often work on these, like even writing requests for proposals involves a lot of design and development work, because you want to be specific to request the right thing. And you want to request what the public wants as well. So I think they did a lot of engagement to set that up. And part of that was, I mean, you said we want to park here and we want to make sure a lot of it's still public space, but let's get housing and let's do this and that. Don't know everything. And then I think they had public meetings throughout the design. I mean, it doesn't change the density of the site, so that's kind of an easy win. It's hard to like get pushback when you're like, the school that's existed but has just been boarded up now will also exist but be alive. And have artwork. It's like every they have all these murals painted by residents or invited artists that change over time. It's a great way to get the community involved. There's a pottery studio. There's some commercial businesses that are now offering jobs and stuff like this. So
What's interesting about this story is that we're starting to see that part of the narrative can be changing private assets into public infrastructure. You know, and I think that here,
Vice versa.
or vice versa. But I'm curious because we also feel like this is happening on a national level in politics and policy, the election cycle right now. I'm curious your take as to how that is shaping out. I mean, YIMBYs are, I think, it's becoming more YIMBY.
Yeah.
Or yes, in my backyard. What do you think we need to do to sort of sustain that momentum? And what do you see emerging potentially in the future that would really push the sort of like, let's continue to build as opposed to let's veto everything. Let's not build. Keep that movement moving forward.
that's a big question. Just to go off your first point, I do think, housing projects are very successful when they become part of a neighborhood and are not just a closed off enclave. We know gated communities. But there's also amenity filled, podium buildings that then don't interact with their community and might have like a cafe on the bottom, but then it's really only serving the residents because of the way it's designed or the retail is set up. So I'm in favor of, and we hope to design and document projects that are part of the community, however they can be within their framework. And then I think people will see density less clearly, hopefully over time. Hopefully it, doesn't detract from their property values and doesn't impact them in the ways they expect. But a lot of the fears people have, of course, it's about change, but there's a lot of very well-founded fears that things will increase traffic, increase kids in schools, and then the school doesn't have enough funding, or it's going to impact the stormwater or the sewage system, which doesn't also have enough funding and is at capacity in a lot of small, mid-sized towns. But I don't think that like solution is to not do something. It's to like, yes, and like do that. And then let's also upgrade that. And we can get development fees from projects to upgrade the requisite infrastructure and help build for the future.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to invest in sewer rather than invest in the process of just presenting the same project over and over.
Yeah. Like the money you spend on your zoning entitlement attorney could be spent on a new sidewalk and bike lane.
Less soft costs, more hard costs. Although hard costs should come down too, hopefully.
Yeah.
But all that soft cost is just sunk cost. Like you don't really, it's not used to something that for the building.
It doesn't add value.
It doesn't add value at all. I mean, I get the point of the community trying to protect themselves by like saying no to what they think it's bad. But if density isn't, density is the issue, then they're like, they're battling with the wrong problem from my perspective. Because density, we need more density, we need more housing. That's a must. If it was not their backyard, they would say yes to it. Yeah. So that's the issue.
Well, but then the question I think is this maybe a lack of leadership. I mean, the conversation is happening all over. Who should be leading the conversation? Who should be the one saying like, no, this is why, and this is also.
We do. I think that's a great point. And you can see zoning reforms fail or pass because of leadership on like the government side to help steer the narrative, not in a way that's disingenuous, but in a way that is leading. So like having the head of a planning board or someone consistently argue for the merits of like transit-oriented zoning model and argue like, on real data and just keep like reinforcing why this is good and dispelling rumors is going to do a lot to over time build people in and help like educate public, not in a way that's pejorative, but in a way that's collaborative. And it's because the public's expertise is not the built environment. And that'll do a lot. And having those courageous, oftentimes public leaders, because housing is like, has to go through, we're in a democracy, compared to people that might be reactionary and just say, oh, well, the public doesn't want this, so we shouldn't do that. But, have a really cheesy reference. Like Steve Jobs was like, well, they don't know what they want. Like no one wanted the iPhone, until he designed it or whatever. And development wise, no bankers know that they want my building until I show them it's really good.
Yeah. But I guess now, like with, the housing crisis being such a big problem, like do you find that more politicians, more local leaders are willing to like come to experts like you to say, hey, like, how do we solve this problem? What can I do? Or has the, I guess, political tenability of this stayed roughly the same?
I think it's exciting to see more political leaders even just talking about housing. We had a professor here, Susan Schindler from the GSD and the Joint Center and a lot of other things come talk at our office. And she was showing like two opposing political ways of talking about housing. One, a opinion piece in the New York Times from Ocasio-Cortez and someone else on their plan for affordable housing. And the image was NYCHA high-rise co-op city buildings. And then the other was a Harris Waltz campaign video, and it had suburban tract housing in Arizona as like their image of housing production, just underlying in a campaign video. So there's a huge diversity, and I'm not, definitely in favor of maybe either model of architecture, but that it's the first time ever we've had like housing come up as a major campaign issue for presidential nominee. And that in itself is great. And that just like more city councilors and mayors are engaged with housing reform. To have city councilors talk to me about single stair is like awesome, because I don't think they've ever been considering the building code for now.
Yeah, so one of the important aspects that we talked about in our previous episodes was the engagement of different generations.
Yeah.
Politicians, counselors, they react to what they hear. And at the meetings, if they only hear pushback from like older generations who don't want any change, that's what they will be echoed. So there needs to be more engagement from the younger or the
think that's a good point. Like someone asked me at a presentation, how can we inform the public about single stair? And I'm so inspired when I see more reels on Instagram and TikTok that are talking about built environment issues. They'll be like influencers comparing parking requirements in and out in Texas to like a block in Manhattan, like how much more housing you could get if you didn't have to park this much. And that's doing a lot of educating for like Americans to learn about the built environment that I don't think I had when we were growing up and didn't know about anything until I went to architecture school.
I think Boston Planning Department is actually doing a great job. They're posting videos on Instagram.
Yeah.
So thank you, Lilibo, and just trying to
Yeah.
the connection.
Social media can be good.
But I think, yeah, like it's a great way to reach people.
Yeah.
I feel like, the books are great and they speak to the people who, really pay attention to stuff. But the average citizen who, might be the person who's
Yeah.
out to vote has very little recourse to learn about these things.
Yeah. And just being exposed to it, then you start to question your surroundings. Like, oh, how did it get this way? Oh, it doesn't have to be this way.
So before we get to the last question, we talked about all of constraints, but also possibilities and opportunities to change and make it better. Curious to know, what is your ideal house? What does it look like, or how does it work?
Well, it's probably a home.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a house. My wife and I do love the row house typology and would love to have maybe just our own attached 3-floor row house townhouse thing. I don't know, like abstractly, I need a yard for my dog. We just want a couple of bedrooms. I now am a homeowner and I know that like how much maintenance it takes to upkeep a building. And so I don't want to have a big building for that reason. Also, I love sharing more intimate spaces and brings the family together. My ideal would be like it's a series of row homes and we're all in a cooperative and we share the backyard and we have meals together, but then we have our own spaces too. And we're like, close to the train and close to Trader Joe's and pottery studio for my wife. And there's a shared wood shop in the back where we can all do projects.
Sounds realistic, I think.
Yeah.
Cheap.
Maybe in a city with lower real estate values. Maybe Minneapolis.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think what's also incredible is that could be your personal ideal, Sam, and that's also something that you can work towards.
Yeah, yeah.
It's maybe power of being an architect, but also one that's more informed and well equipped than just a drawer, just a visionary, someone who's synthesizing all the other things to come together and make it happen. And I think one thing we discussed that's really critical is in the built environment, things can be quite sticky. They don't really happen very quickly, but what does happen is the sort of increase in momentum when you have proof of concept, when you start to see things emerge.
Yeah.
That underwriters, you can go to the bank and be like, no, it does work. See?
Yeah.
That sort of thing. I think that's something I'm sort of moved towards, and it seems like that motivates you quite a bit. But we're going to end on our final question, which is most modern. It's a pun. It's the name of the podcast, but we're also trying to figure out amongst people, especially of our generation, sort of what era we're living in right now. Obviously, housing plays a big role, but in the whole built environment, what do you think describes both the challenges and the opportunities that we're in, and how will we look back on this time, let's say in 30 years?
So is your title, it's like, most modern, but also postmodern,
And a podcast.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know, when I was in school, it was like we're in postmodern, and postmodern styles were coming back in a very postmodern world. The catchy word.
You can describe.
Yeah, I can describe it.
It was what it would be.
I hope we're in an era that can finally reflect on modernism that has happened and look forward in a more meaningful way. So, I mean, modernism is pretty recent, like the Industrial Revolution is really recent. And now I feel like we've gone through enough phases, and different countries in the world have gone through enough phases to feel like, and I don't think the US terms of housing design and development and urban development, it's definitely not leading the way, and we can learn from other contexts. We're leading in some things, not in other things. And so I think it's a new era where we can project forward in a more meaningful way. I was learning about in Amsterdam that they built this whole new area of the city, like many blocks of buildings, all look really fancy and nice. It's now where like Marc Jacobs and fashion houses have their headquarters along the harbor. They're thinking 50 years, 100 years later. So they set up the zoning because it's still industrial, but they want it to eventually be non-industrial. So that's 30 years later, but let's develop it. So they allowed the building as a building. They say, okay, it's industrial now, so probably be commercial tenants because people don't want to live so close to the industry. But they mandated that the floor-to-floor heights and the aspect and proportion of the buildings is the same as residential, but just that it should be commercial for the next 30 years. So then they're looking 50 or 60 years later. And then they're even thinking post-parking. So whereas in the US, we're trying to make underground parking more affordable because it lessens the impact on the ground, realm, the public realm. They're thinking, well, you don't want to do underground parking because it can only ever be parking. Like you can't occupy that space. So they're building above ground parking in limited quantities because eventually in 100 years or 200 years, when we don't need cars at all, need way fewer cars, that can also be another use, whether it's office or residential or something. So it's really, I don't know, exciting to be in a projective time. Maybe this is just because I'm binged the Foundation TV series last weekend. And it's like always like 100 years, like psychohistory, like looking forward. But it's kind of cool to have real examples of how these transitions have happened in the built environment and then project. I think there's a lot of bad projections happening and false narratives about that. But it's, I don't know. We're in a projective time, maybe.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
And it's great. We have people like you to help us imagine what that future looks like.
Yeah. And I think one thing I really vibe with you about is just the fact that we can't do everything, right? Like there's a lot of pressures on the world right now, but if we do start to understand those things and how they fit together, there are a lot of opportunities to move forward. But anyway, thank you, Sam.
Thank you for having me. That's great.
We will definitely link to both the State of Housing Design and the mid-rise report, and the single stair report on here. But is there anywhere else our listeners could potentially find you?
I have an Instagram. I think it's just Sam__Naylor. And I have a website with not much on it, but just catch me on Instagram and I post photos of cool buildings or talks I give and stuff.
Awesome. Well,
Reels about stairs.
I haven't done a reel, but I'll do stories about stairs.
All right. Look out for those.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the conversation. I think it's been really informative and projective too.
Thanks.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern.
Most modern. 모스트 포던 팟캐스트.